Greetings and welcome to another edition of the most powerful platform for truth, bar none, anywhere on God's green earth. This is your platform for information, education, and elevation. This is the Red Pill Diaries, and I'm your host, Rashid, and I want to thank each and every one of you for giving me another hour of your day and some of your time from your day, because I know that time is valuable and I know that it's precious, and I appreciate all of that. We're waiting for Dimitri Lascaris to get in the booth. So while we wait, let's chop it up a little bit. Shout out to No Way Out. Shout out to Net Rando. Shout out to Perseverance Chameleon. Thank you all, and everybody who's watching and who will be in the chat and everything. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Thank you all. Again, we're waiting for Dimitri to join us. It's all good though. If he's a little delayed, he told me that he's in Greece, so he's trying to figure out the time difference and you know, so we'll go through that. But I want to tell you guys about something. We just did an interview. I just did co-hosted Real Truth Talk, right? Fire interview. Man one did a wonderful job. Let me tell you something on Real Truth Talk. The video will be available on the Red Pill Diaries later on this evening or tonight, okay? And we're interviewing a former Serbian captain of the Serbian armed forces who was in Yugoslavia when NATO bombed Yugoslavia and went to war against Yugoslavia. We go into the depths about how this almost triggered World War III, how America's plans were already in effect prior to Ukraine, Georgia, and all of that. And he'll be on this platform soon, okay? So he's accepted my invitation to come on the platform. And when he comes on the platform, I'm going to highlight some of your questions to him. And we'll go from there. The guy is, his name is Mike Mihalovich, I think. I might be mispronouncing it, but it was an excellent interview. And I'd like to give a shout out to my man Juan over at Real Truth Talk. But I want to go into a few things now. We see what's going on in the Middle East right now. Listen, and let me say this right now. If Dimitri is not in the booth in about, say, 10 minutes, I'll hit him up, okay? And I'll hit him up, and we'll see where that goes, okay? But he's, like I said, he told me he was in Greece yet. He was not in the place. I think he was in, I forget which nation. A real small nation in Europe. The last time I interviewed him a few weeks ago, but he told me a few days ago that he was in Greece, and we were trying to get the time thing, and I was telling him, I believe 12 my time would be the time that he wanted to be on the air. So he is probably going back and forth trying to figure that out. Give him a little time. Have patience. Patience is definitely a virtue, and it's an asset that we all should have. But I want to go back to something. Remember a while ago on this platform, I told you that every time the United States loses troops in covert operations, there he is right here. No further delay. We'll come back. No further delay. We'll come back to this topic either later on in the show or later on tomorrow. But I got to bring in my guy, Dimitri Lascaris. How's it going today? I hope you're blessed.
Hey, man, I thank you so much. I'm really sorry for being late. I got tied up.
That's cool. It's cool. I was telling everybody, and besides that, you know, you're not in the same place when that I interviewed you before. You're over in Greece now, and so
that's right.
The time difference. But what is the temperature on the ground in Europe, especially since you're in Greece now, about what's going on in Ukraine and how Russia is chopping apart the Ukrainian forces for the fourth time, and how they're beating the entire Western so-called most powerful military organization in the world?
It depends on who you talk to, but based on what I could see, it's pretty damn hot on the ground. I've yet to see a protest action, a mass protest action that directly and explicitly addresses this depraved proxy war that we have been funding and fueling and prolonging. But what I am seeing right here in Kalamata, in fact, where I am in the very south of Greece, a city of a population of about 80,000 people, is mass protests by farmers, and this is happening all over Europe. And I've been spending a lot of time here in the last couple of years. I have not seen anything like this in Kalamata. When I came into town, returned after a 3-month absence, as I entered the town, there were tractors with Greek flags lined up all along the main boulevard entering into the center of Kalamata. And these farmer protests are happening all over Europe. And really what's driving them is it's becoming increasingly difficult for these farmers to actually make a reasonable living from what they're doing. And a big part of the reason for that is energy costs. They've gone up enormously in Europe because primarily the European continent is being deprived of access to relatively inexpensive Russian energy, and particularly gas, and has become increasingly reliant upon liquefied natural gas from the United States, which is not only much more expensive than Russian gas delivered to the market in Europe by pipeline, it's also more polluting. And so this is having a cascade of effects upon people in this country, not just farmers, but they got fed up. And at the very moment when these protests were happening, I mean, it's really amazing to behold this. The European Union strong-armed the government of Hungary into agreeing, because they were objecting to sending more money to Ukraine. They strong-armed them into agreeing to send another 50 billion euros to the most corrupt country in Europe at a moment when it is absolutely crystal clear to anybody with half a brain and an ounce of objectivity that Ukraine has lost this war. And the government is in crisis. I mean, the infighting that's going on and the intrigue and so forth. So we don't even know how much longer this government that we're sending all this money to is going to last in Ukraine, frankly. So this is creating real problems for European economies, and the political consequences are going to be severe. And the severity has already begun to manifest itself in the street.
I was thinking, how do you think the people will really react when the governments of the West continue to pass more and more spending appropriation bills for this proxy war at the expense of the veterans in each one of those nations' military, at the expense of the average person on the street, at the expense of the farmers, at the expense of the middle class, at the expense of the lower class? I mean, what do you think would be the reaction? We're seeing a little bit of it now, as you said, with the farmers. But do you think it's going to become more intense? Because to me, that's a spit in the face. If I'm the government official, and you're paying me taxes, and you're telling me, hey, we need some of that money for education. We need some of that money to reform healthcare. We need some of that money to create jobs. And you're telling me, and I'm telling you all the while, hey, we don't have money for that. And then you see me come back and discuss with my colleagues, we need to appropriate 40 billion, 60 billion, 100 more billion to Ukraine for a proxy war. Don't you think this thing is going to explode?
Oh, yeah. It's starting to explode. I mean, in Europe, let's look at the German government, been one of the biggest, pushers of this proxy war, this incredibly expensive and depraved proxy war. The government of Olaf Scholz, the Social Democratic chancellor, supposedly Social Democratic chancellor, his popularity has plummeted to almost a record low. And if he were to run today, based upon the polls in Germany, his party would be soundly beaten by a party known as the AfD, which the press, with some justification, characterizes as far right. And they don't like to talk about it in Germany, but a big part of the reason for this is the AfD is saying, stop sending money to this corrupt government in Ukraine, and let's reestablish energy ties with Russia. If this had been a position that had been adopted by one of the mainstream parties in Germany, they'd be wildly popular. But they've ceded that ground entirely to the AfD. And now there's a serious risk that this party, which does have, some pretty odious policy proposals, including especially with respect to immigrants, these people could find themselves in a position of power in Germany. So whatever happens, the German people are going to toss that government out of office. I mean, that's virtually inevitable at this stage. In Britain, the government of Rishi Sunak, the conservative government, again, vitriolically supportive of Zelensky's government, willing to do anything it can to exacerbate and escalate this war, is about to sustain a historic defeat to the Labour Party. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party in Europe, unfortunately, is not likely to pursue a different policy, but they're just so upset they're going to throw the bums out in Britain. Emmanuel Macron, the leader of France, again, his main opponent at this stage is somebody who, with some justification, is characterized as being far right, the Marine Le Pen of the Front National. At this stage, if they were holding a presidential election in France, I think it's probable that he would lose. And again, Marine Le Pen is somebody who wants to reestablish friendly relations with Russia. And you can go right across the political board in this continent. This is a very dangerous situation because the only parties that are offering an alternative, as I mentioned, not just Germany, but elsewhere, to this approach to relations with Russia that's having extremely damaging effects on the European economy are parties of the so-called far right. If you want to keep these people out of power, the best way to do that is respond to the demands of the people. And if you don't, the entire political scene in this continent is going to be thrown into chaos. That's where it's heading. So hopefully saner heads are going to prevail soon, because it's going to become undeniable, probably sometime in the next few weeks, certainly within the next few months, that this war has been an absolute catastrophe from a military and economic perspective for Europe. In the United States, in Canada, it's different. I think the political reaction, you're seeing obviously resistance in Congress to sending more money to Ukraine. I don't know how successful ultimately that resistance is going to be. I think it's going to depend to some extent upon whether or not Trump defeats Biden. And it does appear that Trump, for all of his immense flaws, is inclined not to continue to escalate and prolong this proxy war. But the United States has been less affected at the grassroots level economically by this, because I mentioned there's actually been some benefit to the U.S. petroleum industry. And of course, the arms manufacturers in the United States are making out like bandits from this proxy war. The vast majority of the weaponry is being provided by the United States. So they're actually profiting. But there are people in the United States who are hurting nonetheless, whatever the impacts of this particular war may have been upon ordinary Americans. There's millions of people who are homeless. There's probably well in excess at this stage of 100 million people in the United States who are living in poverty. The polls show that there is widespread discontent, even though the Democrats keep telling Americans the economy is, going gangbusters. There's widespread discontent with the economic management, and with perfectly good reason. Still there's a significant swath of the American public has no access to health care. The healthcare insurance that they're able to access is grossly inadequate, extremely costly. So eventually, the chickens are going to come home to roost in the United States as well, and I think that's begun. But Europe, because it's been impacted so much more negatively from an economic perspective by this war, there's going to be outright rebellion if they continue to pump money into Ukraine.
And on top of that, remember, just a few days ago, what was the Nord Stream 2 project, with all of the technology and all of the investigative skills and levers that all of the European and NATO nations have at their disposal. Now they're saying that they cannot come to a conclusion on what happened and who committed this atrocity or act of war against Germany. Do you think the people are buying that?
Well, I don't. Not anybody with again, sorry to be blunt about this, anybody with half a brain and an ounce of objectivity. I mean, why would the Russians, as was claimed at the outset, blow up their own pipeline? It was absolutely ludicrous. This multi-billion-dollar investment, which was bringing so much revenue to Russia. They had absolutely no motive to blow it up. They didn't need an excuse in their minds to attack Ukraine. Whatever you may think of their justification, they seem to have been persuaded that they had one. So blowing up the pipeline made absolutely no sense. There were really only two alternatives. One was that the Ukrainians did it, and the other is that a Western European country and or the United States working together did it. Seymour Hersh, who has a legendary track record as an investigative journalist, citing a source or sources, possibly more than one, within the United States government, laid out in meticulous detail how the U.S. government at the highest levels had authorized the destruction of Nord Stream. The U.S., then the media responded to this by starting to circulate these completely unsubstantiated and frankly fantastical theories that it wasn't the United States, it wasn't Russia, it was the Ukrainians, or perhaps it was somebody in Eastern Europe, some government in Eastern Europe working in cahoots with the Ukrainians. There wasn't really any credible evidence to support this theory. And just in the last, I think, 48 hours, Sweden, which was conducting an investigation into this thing for months and saying nothing for months about where the evidence was leading its investigation, announced that it had closed the investigation and refused to tell us what it found. They just have straight up refused. Now just stop and think about that for a second. If it was Russia, does anybody think that Sweden would hesitate for 1 second to tell us what the result of its investigation was? Are you kidding me? Does anybody think that Sweden would suppress the evidence if they had evidence that Russia did it? There's only one plausible inference to draw from the fact that Sweden closed its investigation and refuses to tell us what it concluded, even if it was, an uncertain conclusion, even if it was a partial conclusion, which potentially could or could not be correct. Mm-hmm. Tell us something, anything about your investigation. They are telling us nothing. What does that tell you? It definitely was, I think, the United States. And the United States, as I mentioned, at least powerful and influential elements within American society, namely the petroleum industry, profited enormously from this. So, cui bono, as we lawyers say, who benefited? It was unquestionably the United States government and its and the petroleum industry. So, I think the public here is waking up in Europe to the fact that it very likely was the United States government, which and what that means is the United States government committed an act of war against its European allies, not to mention an act of environmental terrorism. The idea that this isn't going to have profound political consequences in the long run is just foolish. I think people need to come to terms with the reality that the Europeans are waking up.
Mm-hmm. And I used to have a few clips on my dashboard. I had Victoria Nuland threatening to shut down the pipeline, and then I had old sleepy Joe Biden himself saying that they have ways of stopping it from working. And after that, the boom, you have the big boom, and nobody knows. And America said we had nothing to do with it, even though you have them on record saying that they would end that pipeline. So, I mean, only a fool would think that the United States did not do it, not just have something to do with, but was the architect behind the destruction of the pipeline. So common sense tells us that I don't care how much you want 1 and 1 to be 7, it's still only 2. And
absolutely, man, absolutely. And Blinken and Nuland were openly celebrating after the fact. Not only did Biden tell us he was going to do it, and Nuland tell us they were going to bring an end to Nord Stream, but when it happened, they said, "Yeah, this is fantastic." I thought that they were opponents of terrorism. How could they possibly? This is civilian infrastructure. This was not, and it was serving the European economy, and they're celebrating. So, I mean, do we really need to connect the dots here? It's obvious, I think, and I think the public's waking up.
And on the day that it was done, like right after it was reported that it was done, remember the Polish official, I think it was the foreign minister, thanked the United States for bringing down the pipeline. I mean, it doesn't get any clearer than that.
Yeah, and now that guy's back in power. So, no, I'm sorry. That fellow who tweeted that, I actually have that image saved on my computer. He took a photograph that was taken from above the site of the destruction of the pipeline, where there's this gas, huge amounts of gas were bubbling up into the atmosphere, and he said, "Thank you, USA." That guy at the time, I think, was a diplomat, and now he is the foreign minister. So he actually has come back into power because Poland, frankly, is a little bit. I think at the point in time in which the election was held in Poland, there probably still was a lot of antipathy towards the Russian Federation, and so that was driving a lot of voters to vote for a party that would continue this policy. But even in Poland itself, you're seeing the government now step back from this war and become antagonistic towards Zelensky, even in Poland, which was one of the biggest cheerleaders for this war. As a European, I have to tell you, somebody who spends a lot of time here, I feel very, very troubled about the future of the continent and the stability of the European Union at this stage.
And what is the average European, the symbol of the average European thought on some of the very nations that were in Europe that were ravaged by Nazism are now supporting the Nazi regime in Kiev?
It's amazing that the media here and the political elite have whitewashed the Nazi elements within the Ukrainian government. Again, this is one of these things these narratives that is starting to break down. There's a big struggle right now in Ukraine between the top general, Valery Zaluzhny, and the comedic president, Volodymyr Zelensky. There's been this ongoing drama about, whether Zelensky's going to fire Zaluzhny and whether Zaluzhny was willing to submit his resignation and who would replace him and blah, blah, blah. And it's been just going on for weeks. Zaluzhny, after he emerged from a meeting with Zelensky, in which this was reported by the U.S. press, the Western press, and was told by Zelensky to hand in his resignation and refused. He posted a photograph of himself with the leader of one of these neo-Nazi parties called the Right Sector, and they were standing together with their arms, around each other in Zaluzhny's office, and behind them there was this huge photograph of Stepan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator, who's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Poles and Jews and Russians, civilians who were massacred by the movement that he co-founded in Ukraine. These men are openly celebrating the legacy of Stepan Bandera, and this man's running the Ukrainian military. And so the media, when they were reporting upon this in the West, they were reporting upon the fact that there was this extraordinary tension between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, but they completely ignored the fact, I didn't see any reports in the West, that Zaluzhny had done this. This is extremely provocative. Why did he do that? Why did he emerge from the meeting with Zelensky and take this picture? This was a message to Zelensky. And the message to Zelensky was, you better be careful because these guys are my friends. The neo-Nazis are on my side. And if you try to extinguish my power, you're going to have to pay. There's going to be hell to pay to these guys, the thugs, the far right thugs. That was the message. It wasn't a coincidence that Zaluzhny put out this photograph at that time. This is horrifying that we're sending weapons to this regime, for God's sakes. In Canada, where I was just a few weeks ago, it's now widely known that the Canadian Parliament gave 2 standing ovations to a Ukrainian Nazi, a man by the name of Yaroslav Hunka, who had openly bragged about the fact that he had served in this unit of the SS called the Galician Waffen SS during World War II. And then when they presented him, and during a visit by Zelensky to Canada, they presented him to the parliamentarians. The Speaker of the House said, "This is a Ukrainian hero who fought against Russia in World War II." And nobody stopped to say, the only people who were really fighting against Russia and Ukraine during World War II were the Nazis. So nobody even hesitated to stand up and give this man a standing ovation. Although I shouldn't say no one, because I found out subsequently, interestingly, that the ambassadors of the Palestinian Authority in Canada and of South Africa, who were in Parliament in that day as observers, they did not give a standing ovation to Zelensky. They had the good sense, to Yaroslav Hunka. They had the good sense not to do that. But in any event, in the last 2 days, it was revealed, at the time when it was revealed the man was a former Waffen SS soldier who fought against the Russians in World War II. Trudeau denied knowing anything about it. And the Speaker of the Parliament, who was an MP from his party, a fellow by the name of Anthony Rota, resigned. Basically, he was the sacrificial lamb for all of this. In the last 2 days, it emerged that Trudeau himself his office invited Yaroslav Hunka to a gathering in honor of Volodymyr Zelensky. It wasn't just Anthony Rota's fault. So Trudeau himself, as I said, this was public knowledge before the standing ovations were given to Yaroslav Hunka in Parliament, that he had served in the Waffen SS. How did Trudeau not know this when his office invited this man to this event honoring Zelensky? And this is like the latest Nazi scandal in Canada's government. The deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, is like the Canadian version of Victoria Nuland, frankly, and who's just far right Ukrainian nationalist. She lied to the Canadian public for months about her grandfather, who was a Nazi collaborator. And after they found this out, apparently the information was leaked to the press by Russian diplomats in Canada at the time. They expelled the Russian diplomats from Canada who exposed this to Canadians. It was true. And Justin Trudeau elevated her afterwards from the position of foreign minister to deputy prime minister. His government has voted twice, at least twice, to United Nations General Assembly resolutions condemning the glorification of Nazism. On his watch, it was discovered by the Canadian press, the mainstream press, that Canada's military was training neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. At some point, I'm going to be writing an article about this soon. You have to ask the question: is Justin Trudeau a Nazi? I mean, my God, how much evidence do we need before we begin to at least ponder that possibility? I myself think it's something that we need to start having a discussion about. Certainly, the tolerance for Nazism within the government of Canada and other Western governments is absolutely shocking. This is a discussion that's going to be had, and it's not going to be pretty.
Well, that goes back. I don't think this just started, because look, if you look back to during Nazism, its height, Prescott Bush, his companies helped fund Hitler. They helped fund the war machine, and then you see policies that were beneficial to the growth of Nazism being funded by not only Prescott Bush, but his friends who have children who are still in government. You see, I don't think this is by chance or coincidence. I think what it is bubbling to the top.
Absolutely, 100%. Another thing, again, to just trot back to Canada, because your audience may be interested to know this, probably hasn't been widely publicized in the United States. There was a commission appointed by the Canadian government, I think it was back in the 1990s, which looked into the immigration to Canada of Nazis from Europe in the aftermath of World War II. And it discovered that there were quite a few people who were allowed to emigrate from Eastern Europe, and including in particularly Ukraine, who were known to be Nazis by the Canadian government at the time that they were allowed to emigrate here. Okay, and at the time, so after one of the after effects of this scandal in Canada's Parliament, where they gave a standing ovation to Yaroslav Hunka, is that Jewish organizations began to demand that the government declassify that report. It's called the Deschênes report, because not all of it had been released to the public. Well, in the last few days, the government, under pressure from these Jewish organizations, declassified large parts of the report that had been redacted and withheld for decades from the Canadian public. And they found out that Justin Trudeau's father, who was the foreign minister at the time, was fully aware that there were Ukrainian neo-Nazis in the country, and had instructed the foreign ministry, or those under his service in the government, to conceal this fact from Canadians, because he felt that this was going to cause ethnic tensions in Canada. I mean, some nonsense like that. So this is the thought. It's extraordinary that the son, in the aftermath of the work of the Deschênes Commission, which was suppressed by his father, is now showing overt signs of sympathy for Nazism. And you're absolutely right. This is a phenomenon that goes all the way back to the time of the Nazi German era itself. There is a mountain of evidence that Western governments were not only tolerant of Nazism, and also Western corporations, as you mentioned, people who were wealthy coming from Western economies, including the United States, that they were working with the Nazis and collaborating with Nazis for their own nefarious purposes for quite a long time. And that never stopped. It never ended. And that's what's become abundantly clear now.
So what we're seeing in slow motion is the corruption that has bubbled beneath the surface for so long, turning into boils and starting to burst. And I think it is starting to enrage a lot of people who thought that the West was this benevolent carer of humanity and human rights. And now you're seeing that they are totally opposite of what they put on to be. I'm a human rights defender. I'm this. You said something about Nazism, which I wanted to get back to before it leaves my mind. And we talked about the funding of the U.S. government of Nazism. We talked about Canada and Freeland. We talked about the Nazis across Europe. But why do you think it's so imperative for Israel to help fund the Ukrainian Nazis when they're always talking about the Holocaust?
The Israeli government, frankly, all it cares about is support for its project of oppressing, dispossessing, and brutalizing the Palestinian people. And it will align itself with any political force or movement in the world, particularly in the West, that supports that project, which is, brazen violation of or series of violations of international law and human rights. Just think about the fact that the Israeli government, if it actually really cared about anti-Semitism, why would it engage in the brutalization of the Palestinian people for decades, and now in ways that the whole world can see, according to a U.S. judge, are plausibly genocidal, and at the same time call itself the Jewish state? It doesn't speak for the Jewish people. It has no authority to represent to global public that it is the representative of the Jewish people. The Jewish people did not elect that government. There is a segment of the Jewish population within Israel itself, which is a small segment of the global Jewish population, which elected that government. And by the way, that segment of Israeli population is highly propagandized and has been taught from a very young age to detest and loathe the Palestinian people. But it's not a representative of the Jewish people. When you're running around, you're committing acts that are so horrifying that the International Court of Justice, by a vote of 15-2, says it's plausible that you're committing genocide, and you're calling yourself the genocide, the Jewish state. It is inevitable that you are going to generate antipathy to the Jewish people. People shouldn't hold the Jewish people responsible for the crimes of the government of Israel. Absolutely not. But some people are going to end up believing the claim of the Netanyahu regime that it represents global Jewry, and this is going to exacerbate anti-Semitism. So, it is fundamentally anti-Semitic to say that a genocidal policy of a state is representative of the Jewish people. That's anti-Semitic. The Israeli government doesn't care. All it cares about is dispossessing and brutalizing the Palestinian people, and apparently that's all Western governments care about too.
But this is leading the West towards total economic collapse because they're bombing the Yemeni people. They're trying to dominate the waterways over there. They're also helping and they're arming Israel to the T to do what she's doing and providing real-time intelligence. In a time where your economics base is tenuous at best, I would say, how can you constantly afford to give money to Israel and Ukraine? Let's say the bill that they tried to pass now is what, $100 and some billion, $150, $160 billion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now,
this in itself is lunacy because first of all, it takes 20 billion according to the HUD office, which is a part of the federal government, says that it would only take $20 billion to eliminate homelessness in America. Another 20 to 40 billion to completely eradicate poverty in America. So we say 40 to 60 billion. for that. They don't have the money for that, and they don't have the money for Head Start and education, which is the base of any successful and progressive society. You must have a thriving educational system. And when you defund your educational system, you in the long term, you defund the republic or the national sovereignty of the nation, because you are raising fools and people who have limited scopes of understanding and knowledge. So saying that, how do you think the people who America borrows the money from, seeing her in her escapades around the globe, causing war, bombing people, ignoring the interests and the national interests of everybody else, how do you think they feel when America does not have money to pay them back, but she can borrow more money to give to Israel, Ukraine, and for war?
Yeah, and I just want to point out, the population of Israel has things that the American people don't. They have, the education system. I agree with everything you said, 100%. The cost of education in Israel is extraordinarily low by U.S. standards, and they have a national healthcare system. And you've got tens of millions of Americans who don't have any healthcare at all, and probably somewhere in the range of 150 or 200 million who have this crappy healthcare that costs them a fortune and doesn't provide them anywhere close to, comprehensive health coverage. And they're looking at this money going across to Israel. Israel gets $3.8 billion a year, independently of the money you just talked about, this gargantuan bill that they're, trying to push through Congress and the Senate to spend yet more money on this corrupt proxy war in Ukraine. They're sending this money to, a country, Israel, a chunk of it, that is already getting $4 billion a year from the United States government, and that has higher quality healthcare and education than the United States, the people in the United States. That people can see this. This is why Biden is now at the lowest point of popularity in his presidency. He's at a 37% approval rating, and as I mentioned earlier, he's 5 points behind Trump in the polls, after the mainstream media have done everything imaginable to demonize and vilify Trump. I have nothing but criticism to articulate about Trump. I ain't no fan of Trump, but it's shocking that Biden is significantly behind Trump in the polls after all the efforts have been made to destroy his candidacy for the Republican Party. Why is this? Why is this happening? Because people can see that the Democratic Party doesn't give a damn about the American people. All they care about is fueling and funding wars abroad and enriching their donors in the arms industry. That's all they care about. Mm-hmm. And all this talk about international law and human rights is complete bunk. People now can see this. What more proof do you need than the fact that Genocide Joe is shipping on a daily basis 2,000-pound bunker bombs to a government that is in the process of committing a genocide? Give me a break. People outside of the West, there is almost universal understanding about what the Biden administration is actually doing, that it's enabling a genocide. And even within the United States itself, the polling numbers on the whole question of Israel are looking extremely dire for the Democratic Party. There was something, I think, in the range of, they had a poll out recently which showed that despite the pro-Israel coverage of the mainstream media, 36% of Americans believe that Israel is committing genocide. 35%, and only 36%, almost exactly the same percentage, disagreed, and the rest didn't know. And in the Democratic Party, the number was in excess of 50%. They believe, despite the incredibly pro-Israel coverage in the mainstream media on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, all the rest of it, the New York Times, over 50% of Democrats think that Israel is committing genocide, and Genocide Joe is shipping bombs to them on a daily basis. This is a situation that is unsustainable. It's politically unsustainable. Genocide Joe is going to go down in flames unless he reverses course real fast.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that all of the so-called anti-war parties and protesters, they disappeared when Joe Biden came to office, right? They're not out there in the streets demanding the stop and the halt to war. But I want to bring something to your attention for a second. We talk about what's going on in Palestine and Israel, and we say that America is doing this because she wants to maintain hegemony, dollar hegemony, and Israel wants greater Israel and all of that. But I want to advance something else that may be a part of all of this that I think is overlooked by mostly everybody. I've been doing a little research, and I noticed that for the last year or so, Israel's economy had been in the tanks, and a few times it was close to collapse. And then we look at America, look at the debt burden that she has, and look at last year she had some debt sales that did not generate any buyers, so the Fed had to buy the debt. So now we look at that and we say Israel is in trouble, and Israel needs some funding from the United States to maintain her position there. And then we see that the United States is under tremendous debt strain. Couldn't this be a concerted effort by Israel and America to just say, you know what, to hell with everything, we're gonna wage war, and if we can save the dollar through this waging of war, that's better. But if not, at least we can damage our adversaries to a point where they can't do what we believe they would be capable of if our economies collapse, because they have to know. They have to know the dire situation of both economies because of the debt.
I think they know, but at this point, these people, we need to understand that the people in power in the United States and in Europe do not care about the long-term interests of their countries. They just don't. What they care about is their own power, their own privilege, and the way that these people came to power, frankly, was through significantly support from the arms manufacturers in the West, and particularly the United States. The donations, their campaigns are funded in significant part by the wealthy proprietors of the arms industry. There's basically this money laundering scheme going on in Congress, where they funnel just gigantic amounts of money. The military budget, which goes up every year in the United States, now consumes, I think, something like 50% of discretionary spending in the country. They funnel this money, largely borrowed money, into the arms industry, and the arms industry, pumps it back into the political elite. It's basically a money laundering scheme at this stage, and so all they care about is keeping that game going for as long as possible, even if it's going to destroy their country economically in the long run. And the United States government's gotten away with this up until now, because the United States dollar is the global reserve currency. It's used for international commerce, has been for decades. And so because there's this enormous demand for US currency, the United States government is able to borrow gigantic sums of money at rock bottom interest rates. The problem is that the United States has so abused its position as the controller of the global reserve currency, by imposing sanctions on countries, most recently with disastrous effect, the Russian Federation, that countries around the world are now trying to move away from the dollar as the trade of international currency. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and which is expanding now to include countries that are very important economically, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, and other countries around the world. They are actively pursuing, trade structures that liberate their economies from the U.S. dollar. And that means demand for the U.S. dollar in the long run is going to go down. That means the cost of borrowing is going to go up. And this scam that the United States government has been running for decades, where it's constantly borrowing more and more money to fuel the weapons production, and that money laundering scheme I mentioned, it's not sustainable anymore. It's simply not sustainable. Essentially, the United States economy will collapse from a mountain of debt that it can no longer sustain if it continues on this trajectory. And as I said, regrettably, the people who are in power in the United States don't seem to give a damn about that. They're just going to keep this scam going for as long as they can and enrich themselves in the process.
So don't you think these people are lunatics? And one of the reasons that lead me to that conclusion is, if China, and I say this on a lot of programs, if China is your number one investor and China is your number one lender, and 93 to 95% of all goods on all shelves in the United States come from China or a subsidiary of China, why then would you go and antagonize China and position your troops near China under the threat of war? Isn't that lunacy?
Lunacy. It's lunacy. I mean, yeah, what other conclusion could you draw? These people are nuts. They're absolutely bonkers. You know, I mean, the Chinese, I saw an amazing statistic recently that the industrial capacity of China is greater than the next 10 countries combined. Okay, it's not just the United States, which is critically dependent now upon the industrial base of China. It's, you know, much of the world, and particularly the Western economies, and they're sending ships into the South China Sea, you know, and creating potential flashpoints that could lead to, you know, outright war between China and the United States and its Western allies. A war, by the way, which I think the United States would absolutely lose. There's just no question that the United States would get wiped out in that war. Why? Not because China has a stronger military than the United States, but because the United States would be required in a war with China to project its power on the other side of the Pacific. And the logistical challenges of doing that are enormous. Whereas China would be, you know, defending its own territorial waters and its own border, its own coastline, and would be confronted by far fewer logistical challenges. This is not a war that the United States can win. And not only are they sending ships into the South China Sea, they're sending, you know, surveillance aircraft right up to the edge of Chinese airspace, and they're sending weapons, billions of dollars of weapons, into Taiwan, which, according to the U.S. government's own policies, is part of the same state as China. And this has been the policy, the one China policy of the United States for decades. This is an absolutely, what inference can we draw except that these people are completely bonkers? You know, this is a policy that makes no sense whatsoever.
And it seems like they don't put their foot on the brakes. They don't pause. It's like, if they see this wall ahead, I'm going to speed up. Maybe if I run into it as hard as I can penetrate the wall. I mean, it is absolutely insane. And it seems like the Western media, mainstream, and a lot of so-called alternative media do not pose those questions or say, why are they doing that? Are these people lunatics? And if they are crazy, should they not be removed from office?
Yeah, but you know, we're seeing a rapid decline in not only trust in the mainstream media, but in the profitability of the mainstream media. The signs of this are everywhere because people understand increasingly that they're being lied to, and that the function of these media corporations, not just in the United States, but throughout the West, has never been to tell people the truth. It's never been to inform the citizenry. This has been to serve the interests of the people who own these massive media corporations. You know, and one of the ways in which they enrich themselves is keeping this, you know, scam going in Congress, where, you know, huge amounts of borrowed money are funneled into arms manufacturers and then cycled back to the political elite. So people now are finding alternative ways to get their news, like your program. You know, I think that this is probably, at this stage, programs like yours, other independent media outlets, are a more important source of information for Americans than the mainstream media, and that at any point in the history of the United States, not-for-profit, independent people within the media space are having a greater influence on the public discourse than the traditional legacy for-profit media. And this is just going to get worse for them. The ability of the United States government and its allies in the West to sustain their propagandistic narratives is eroding by the day. And this is going to be, as I said, it's going to cause a political earthquake.
Well, do you think that as the economic situation becomes more dire across Europe, because it's going to become more dire across Europe and across the United States because of the sanctionings of Russia, do you think that this will force them to into a real appraisal of their policy? And the reason I ask you that, before you answer, the reason I ask you that is, okay, Europe has little to no natural resources. They must import gas, a huge sum of gas and oil. Okay, they shot themselves in the stomach, chest, and head by sanctioning Russia. All right. Now, the United States has an ample supply of gas, oil, and resources. But the problem with the United States is it's so far in debt that most people don't realize that it costs money to invest in technologies and stuff to extract the resources. And that money the U.S. no longer has. So as this thing bites Europe, I think it's going to bite back at the United States a lot too. And what do you see happening when more businesses, banks, and are closing and more jobs are being cut off?
Well, I think it's going to depend on whether there's a real political alternative for voters. I mean, I can't imagine that these people who have brought us to this point in this war in Ukraine and now in what is happening in Israel and Palestine are going to reverse course because they're so politically invested in it now. I mean, for them to pull out, for the Biden administration, for example, and the government, the conservative government of the United Kingdom and Macron and all these other clowns, to pull out now and tell the people the truth about this war, that it's a failure, that it's unwinnable, that it's always been unwinnable, would be political suicide. They're just so invested in it. So there are going to be other alternatives that the public is going to turn to. And unfortunately, in Europe, as I mentioned, some of those alternatives right now, the only ones that are really speaking out against this proxy war are on the right of the political spectrum. The parties that the left is basically, thrown in the towel on opposing militarism and opposing dangerous foreign policies and imperialism. So I'm really concerned about, where this is all heading. One way or another, it's unsustainable. And hopefully those of us, I happen to be, a socialist, I identify as a socialist. And we on the left need to begin to offer to the, and the anti-imperialist movement, we need to be offering to the public in the West an alternative, a more attractive alternative to the people than parties like the AfD in Germany and Marine Le Pen in France are offering to the people. And if we don't do that, we're going to end up with those people in power. And they're going to pursue policies which are not going to be compatible with those you're seeing played out in Ukraine, but they're also going to pursue other policies that we're going to deeply regret, that are going to have very negative impacts upon ordinary working class citizens. So, we have a great challenge ahead of us. Those of us who care about, the interests of ordinary workers, ordinary people, to navigate a way through this political earthquake that's coming, which will not result in us ending up under the rule of far-right parties.
So you say that they won't change directions because it would be political suicide. To me, that shows a character flaw in them to put themselves in their career above their nation, because these are people who claim to be patriots of their nation, and they are willing to drive that car off the road, even though there's a sign up there ahead that says, "Hey, bridge is out." And they say, "Well, I've driven down this path 1,000,000 times. The bridge is not out. The sign just says that." And so they continue to go and they speed up. And when they get to the end, they just go over the ledge and instead of acknowledging the wrong that they've done. That, to me, that's arrogance. That's narcissism. To put yourself, your career, and your financial stability over an entire nation or collection of nations, and saying that, aren't these people megalomaniacs and sociopaths? Because think about the lives that are lost. Just think about the lives that are lost because you don't want to acknowledge you were wrong on a policy initiative. And all of these people are dying. All of this land is being destroyed and contaminated, and all of the loss of wealth because you, in your arrogance, refuse to acknowledge that you were wrong.
Man, what you're saying is music to my ears. I've been saying this for years. These people are psychopaths. I mean, I'm just going to tell you one thing for me personally that was, and I'm not shocked easily by the behavior of these people anymore. But this was truly astonishing, and tells you all you need to know about the moral character or lack thereof of these people. And that is, on the day that the International Court of Justice rendered that decision against Israel, within hours of the decision coming out, the United States, Canada, and I think some 15 other Western nations announced that they were suspending funding to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, upon whose work hundreds of thousands of Palestinians depend for their very survival. And never were they in greater need of the support, this organization called UNRWA, than they are at this particular moment because of the devastation in Gaza. They suspended funding to this organization upon which their survival depends. Based on what? Based on unsubstantiated, evidence-free allegations by Israel, the very state that was found by the International Court of Justice to be plausibly committing genocide, that 12 of 30,000 employees in this humanitarian organization, UNRWA, had somehow been involved in the attacks of October 7th. Just magically, Israel announced this on the day that the ICJ rendered its decision. It didn't know beforehand. This was a cynical attempt by Israel to, in fact, use Western government complicity in its genocidal project to exacerbate the suffering of the Palestinian people, and also to distract attention away from the decision of the International Court of Justice. And all the leaders in the West, or most of them, not all of them, frankly, were quite willing to play along with this scam. And we only found out in the last 48 hours, Channel 4 News in the United Kingdom got its hands on the document, the Israeli document, which the decision to suspend funding was based upon. And that document doesn't contain an iota of evidence, and Israel has refused to disclose the so-called evidence that it has, that these people, these 12 people, were somehow involved in the October 7th attacks. I have difficulty imagining something more depraved than what the governments that suspended UNRWA's funding did on that day. It's beyond my ability to even articulate how shocking it is. But one thing we can say, I think, at this stage with absolute confidence, again, I come up with your adjective, man. These people are not. They don't have any conscience. They don't have an ounce of decency. They have no shame, none whatsoever. They don't care about any of us at all. This is all about their own power and enrichment. And if we don't rid ourselves of this pestilence, which is the political elite in the West, we're finished. We're finished not only as countries, we're finished as a species. The highest priority of every citizen of conscience should be to disempower the Western political elite before it's too late.
Man, that says a lot right there. I guess we'll leave it right there. Oh, man, thank you for joining me, Dimitri. Man, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate having me on, and keep up the great work.
I'll send you a copy of the interview, man. Thank you. And be blessed and be safe out there also.
You too. Take care.
All right. Everybody listen. I want to thank you all for joining, but listen, before we go off there, let me make a few announcements. First of all, you got to go check out Juan's interview. I was a co-host over there earlier, and I got to say it, over at Real Truth Talk. Fire interview. Fire. He did a fire interview. I'm telling you, with a captain of the Serbian army. Fire interview. It'll be posted later on tonight or early in the morning on the Red Pill Diary. So even if you see it over there, come back and I want him to get his views first. Then come back over here and look at it again. You can never look at something like that too much. Also, I talked to Kalza, and we will be doing the show Saturday because he had another show scheduled, and it would only give him like 3 or 4 minutes in between. He had to be on my show, and I couldn't put him like that. I just can't put any people in awkward positions like that just for the show. The show can come on Saturday. Tomorrow, I don't know if it will be a channel member stream or a regular stream or a Patreon stream. If it is a Patreon stream tomorrow, it will be available on Patreon first and then on Locals. That's the empowerment of locals, the empowerment of truth.locals.com for free after the patrons get a chance to look at it. We're supposed to have Matthew Ehret back on a live stream, and he'll be talking about the secret societies and the government's plans and how they are all working to try to shape their so-called world order. We're going to be talking about a lot of that. We're going to be bringing up a lot of the news. So all of that is in store for you all. Like I told you, we got some heavy, hard-hitting stuff, and I think We'll have a few guests on next week, if I'm not mistaken. I got to check the schedule. But I just want to keep each and every one of you informed. Please go to every one of our platforms. Twitter, Twitch, Rumble, Odyssey, Locals, YouTube, and subscribe. And if you like, become a channel member or a patron on patreon.com/the Red Pill Diaries. Also, I'm gonna give you everything I got. I don't play around. I don't hide things. I tell you exactly what's on my mind, and I don't sugarcoat it. So for those of you who may be new to this, keep coming back and you'll see. Also, hit the like button and subscribe, okay? I would really appreciate that. If you don't subscribe, hit the like button. But what is a subscription if it's free? I mean, you can do that. It's not going to hurt you to do that. That'll show the channel some love, and we can beat the algorithm. On that note, hey, we may come back later if I get back in town. Get back here. We may do a little short stream. If not, look for the stream tomorrow. May God bless each and every one of you. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart to the depths of my soul for giving me your hour of time. Know that I love you if you love truth, but know that my love will always pale in comparison to the love that Almighty God has for you. Remember that when you're going through hard times also. Remember that. Because a lot of us, we go through hard times and we go through trials and tribulations. And sometimes the pain of those trials and tribulations hurt so deeply that we can't think through the fog. So whenever you are a brain fog or a heart fog or whatever like that, think through that and know that there's a supreme being that loves you. He loves you so much that he brought you out of nothing and made you into something. So when you think about that and think about how blessed you are to be on this side of the ground, it should liven up your spirits. But remember that he loves you more than I could ever love you. On that note, I go out the same way I come in. Mama, know what? Your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I am Audi 5,000 people.